Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ancient Philosophy. I'm your instructor, Matthias Warnes. I would like to always look like this for our class, but Snap Camera and Camtasia haven't figured out how to get along. I put in a help ticket. If we're being honest, though, I'll probably mostly look like this.
Will you fly like a teacher in the sky?
Stick it again.
This is my first time teaching ancient philosophy for CSUS. I've taught it once before for Folsom Lake College. I noticed that this is definitely a majors class. We seem to have, I think, about 14 philosophy majors. So that's exciting. I've never taught a class before that had so many philosophy majors in it. Although I've only taught it once before, ancient philosophy is definitely one of my favorite classes to teach of all time, up there with existentialism and maybe just one or two others. My love affair and fascination with ancient Greek philosophy began a long time ago, probably when I was about your age, in my early 20s. And since I focused my PhD work on complicated German philosophers, you could, let's just say, focus on ancient philosophy was continuous for the last 20 years. I think the canvas for our course is fairly straightforward, especially since most of you are seniors. Don't be too overwhelmed by the number of readings, because as you go week to week, you will see that you have several options usually for what to do your assignments on. I'm going to use my weekly lecture videos to give an overview of all the readings for a week, sometimes focusing on specific ones, but mostly giving you a taste of everything that's on offer in a given week so that you can then focus in on what most catches your fancy. As always, make sure to read the syllabus and homepage very carefully and to poke around throughout Canvas to take a look at all the different aspects of the course. Our Zoom discussions, which will mostly be discussing the text itself, but which also can field practical and course business-related questions, will begin in week 3. But if you have any pressing questions about course structure and organization before then, feel free to reach out. So without further ado, let's get into the fun business of introducing ancient Greek philosophy. Oh, now that I'm doing PowerPoint and screen sharing, you will not be able to see my true form. I really hope Camtasia fixes this with Snap Camera soon. So here you see of an image that is, of course, well known to most of you, or at least part of the image, of Raphael's The School of Athens. Believe it or not, by the time you finish the course, all these names and many, many, many more will be like household names to you, and you will know a significant amount about all of them. An important proviso, which the German philosopher Martin Heidegger put at the beginning of his 1926 lectures, that was a mistake there, the first systematic series of lectures he gave on the topic, is he asked the students, well, are you going to understand everything that we are talking about here? And some people put a high premium on universal accessibility, universal understanding. The idea, however, that we can make ancient Greek philosophy universally accessible and understandable in all its details is pretty ludicrous. Hopefully I'm preaching to the choir here, since most of you are philosophy majors, but that really is not how the activity of learning to think philosophically and reading ancient philosophical texts work. Heidegger calls the move to universal educational accessibility of all information embedded, supposedly, in our philosophical legacy truly appalling and a perversion and corruption of philosophy. And helpfully informs us that to study philosophy means to decide in favor of transparency in one's own scientific or scholarly acting, forbearing and existing at the university, and it has very little to do with blind preparation for exams or non-deliberate nibbling on intellectual tidbits. When we study philosophy in the right way, especially ancient philosophy, since the ancients were probably more than us actually doing philosophy, what we should be actually aiming for is a letting advance, Heidegger writes, of the authentic possibilities of human Dasein, and so that genuine scientific or scholarly questioning can emerge, and no mere accidental knowledge about, say, names and dates. And many of you have probably already heard Alfred North Whitehead's famous characterization of the history of philosophy, saying that its safest general characterization is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Some of you have probably studied Plato a bit, or maybe in your free time in other classes. or on your own. But in this class, we're not even going to get to Plato until week 8. So we're going to be really working carefully through the entire philosophical build-up that leads to Plato, Aristotle, and subsequently Hellenistic philosophy. There are some wonderful epigraphs in Hadot's book, What is Ancient Philosophy? And I've included just a few here. Nietzsche writes in Human All Too Human, "The time will come when, in order to perfect ourselves morally and rationally, we will prefer to have recourse to Xenophon's Memorabilia rather than the Bible." Pascal in the Pensées already expressed his distaste for our common cultural image of the Greek philosopher with white flowing robes and looking very philosophical and also pedantic by remarking that philosophers like Plato and Aristotle were honest men who laughed with their friends, amused themselves with writing about law and politics, and did it all for fun. This was the least philosophical and serious part of their lives. The most philosophical part was living simply and quietly. Plotinus, a famous Neoplatonist who we'll eventually get to, remarks that it is desire or yearning for self-perfection that engenders thinking. And Thoreau in Walden says, "Nowadays, there are many philosophy professors, but where did the philosophers go?" The Hadot book is probably the most readable source or secondary source that we have in this class, so I hope you'll all get a lot of good information out of reading it carefully across the semester. The basic idea across this book is that philosophy is more a way of life associated with a particular school or an ethos, rather than the doctrines of individual philosopher endlessly competing as individualists. Accordingly, the best way to study some of the material for our class, if not most of it, is to take it to a beautiful location in nature. And in fact, most of it is about nature, so I recommend that you do that, as I'm doing here. The ancient philosophers developed the most extraordinary and subtle reflections on the problems of knowledge, logic, physics, etc., but the specific doctrines were less important than the way they were taught and the way of life that they led to. Philosophical discourse originated in a choice of life and an existential option, and this choice and decision were never made in solitude. Though the philosophical school corresponds, above all, to the choice of a certain way of life, which demands from the individual a total change of lifestyle, a conversion of one's entire being, and ultimately a desire to be and to live in a certain way. The reason, or logos, within the philosophical discourse is there to reveal and justify the choice of a particular existential option and representation of the world, rather than vice versa. In ancient philosophy, philosophy is merely a preparatory exercise for wisdom, which is extra discursive and involves the completion and perfection, or telos, of life. This is not dissimilar to 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who at the end of the Tractatus said that now that his philosophical discourse had been transcended, he could return to silent wisdom. The term discourse, Hadot understands discursive thought, usually translated as dialectics, a back and forth and refinement of ideas, but more generally than that, and more accurately, as language, logos. And Hadot is careful to point out that thinking doesn't only happen in concepts, but also in images. Children, animals, and those with cognitive disabilities think, and they sometimes think philosophically for Hadot. Ancient philosophy includes not just thinking in general or thinking in terms of the concept, but also the specific sense of thinking as discourse, which might be a thinking in images. Hadot thus understands the whole scope of ancient philosophy from 600 BC to 600 AD, roughly, as a sequence of differing and developing spiritual exercises. Some of these exercises are physical, as in dietary regimes, or discursive, as in dialogue and meditation, or intuitive, as in contemplation. They're all intended to effect a modification and a transformation of the subject who practices them. So please go out not only into nature, but as you read and afterwards meditate and develop a meditation practice on what you are absorbing. You'll certainly get a lot more out of it. Much of the material we study in this class is not only about learning the, quote, philosophies and getting them, quote, correct, but it is about learning to think meditatively and to have a little of the philosophical way of life of the ancients rub off on us. As already mentioned, the periods of ancient Greek philosophy span roughly 1,000 years, from the Pre-Socratic period, which was really just about a century, the classical period, about a century and a half, the era of Plato and Aristotle, and then the Hellenistic period, about 3 centuries, from the late 4th to the 1st century BCE, and then the later Hellenistic and Roman period, which extends far into late antiquity until the rise of Christianity, more or less. As our course will develop a particular focus across at least 6 weeks on the Pre-Socratic philosophers, I've also assigned Giannis Damatellos' Introduction to the Pre-Socratics, which has much more useful and readable information in it on the Pre-Socratics than our main textbook, which we'll use more in the second half of the course. Damatellos helpfully identifies the major themes of Pre-Socratic inquiry by chapters, including all the different Pre-Socratic philosophers on principles or origins, arche, on the nature of the cosmos, usually phusis or cosmos, on the nature of being, inai, on the human soul or animal soul, suke, on the nature of knowledge, episteme, and on ethics. The chapters from this book are assigned in sequence, sometimes 2 a week for the next 6 weeks. It's a good idea to give them a read-through when they're assigned. However, the nature of the material is such that each chapter covers the whole spectrum of Pre-Socratic philosophy from the point of view of a particular theme. We'll also have the opportunity to review subsections on individual philosophers in the weeks that we're covering them. Probably the reason why ancient Greek philosophy is one of my favorite things to study is because I just have a love for Greece. Has anyone out there ever been to Greece before or explored around it? If so, tell us about your adventures in the introductory forums this week. I first went to contemporary Greece when I was about 9 years old on a family vacation with my uncle and aunt, and returned subsequently until almost every year until I graduated high school. I'd never felt more at home anywhere in the world than I have in Greece. It's just an absolutely beautiful place to be. The Greek-speaking world in ancient times, of course, extended considerably beyond its boundaries today, which is roughly this area here. It included major colonies on the Italic Peninsula, as well as further west, which we'll hear about later, and further east. This map shows us the major sites for the Pre-Socratic philosophers in particular. We can see at the very beginning of the world of the Pre-Socratics was very cosmopolitan, involving a lot of travel and sometimes migration between various centers of intellectual and spiritual activity in the ancient world. The story of Pre-Socratic philosophy is often said to start with Thales from Miletus over here, and this is the Ionian Sea, so these are locations for the Ionian philosophers, and to have subsequent interventions and transformations on the basis of Eleatic philosophers such as Parmenides, who is said to hail from Elea. Sometimes west versus east is configured as a difference of philosophical principles, but as we're going to see, really all these Pre-Socratic philosophers are part of the tradition of Ionian natural philosophy, which emerges over here. Interestingly, the word philosophia did not emerge until the 5th century BCE. It was not thematized until Plato. There's some testimonia which suggests that Pythagoras called himself a philosopher and spoke of philosophia, but it's not decisive. Since Plato and Aristotle, the term philosopher was applied universally to the earliest thinkers, including Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, the Milesians, hailing from Miletus. The intellectual movement then spread to the Greek colonies in Sicily and southern Italy. A famous Ionian philosopher, Xenophanes of Colophon, emigrated to Elea, and Pythagoras, who originally came from the Ionian area in Samos, settled in Crotona, not that far from what would become Rome. How did all this start? Why did philosophy come to be in Greece? Some of the commentators will study, in fact, go so far as to say philosophy only began in Greece, the West, Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy would only have a Western origin. We know this now to be pretty untrue. I would argue the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and Hindu culture in the Indus Valley region, as well as Chinese thinkers, all developed what I think we can recognizably and decisively say is philosophy. But before getting into these debates about the specificity or lack thereof of Greek philosophy over other forms of philosophy that emerged all around the same period, the so-called Axial Age, 5th, 6th century BCE, we begin with something a bit more universal. That is Aristotle on the origin of philosophy from wonder. In the Metaphysics, he writes that it is not a science of production is clear even from the history of the earliest philosophers, for it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize. wondered originally at the obvious difficulties, then advanced little by little and stated difficulties about the greater matters, e.g., about the phenomena of the moon and those of the sun and of the stars, and about the genesis of the universe. And a man who is puzzled and wonders thinks himself ignorant, whence even the lover of myth is in a sense a lover of wisdom, for myth is composed of wonders. Note there that religion and mythology are also activities of the wondering human soul, and so not opposed but rather in alliance with philosophy. In any case, philosophers philosophized in order to escape from ignorance, and they were pursuing science in order to know, not for any utilitarian end. Paul goes on to say philosophy is unique in that it is alone pursued for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. Our main textbook for primary sources, especially once we get to Plato and beyond, is Ancient Philosophy, Essential Readings with Commentaries. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is the only book that I couldn't find. It easily available to a sort of piratey search online. Introduction in this textbook adds a few bits of detail to our study of philosophy which seem helpful, especially on the textual historical approach. The editor's note, only about 10% of ancient philosophy has survived. What has survived is via copies of copies, and in very few cases do we have any surviving manuscripts prior to 900 CE. In late antiquity, there was a decline in the use of papyrus scrolls, or biblios, due to the difficulty of importing the plant from Egypt. During this period, goatskin or sheepskin was used, called parchment, which is more like our modern books. Both, unfortunately, were biodegradable. Many libraries were destroyed through natural disasters and intellectual pogroms, and modern editions are based on comparison of consistencies and inconsistencies in surviving copies. Editions of surviving fragments and treatises of ancient philosophy were only translated into English widely in the 18th century, and new translations of most of these works now appear in every generation. Next point is a very helpful one. If you haven't learned the Greek alphabet and know a little bit of Greek, which I assume applies to all of you? No? Let me know. Consulting multiple different translations is an excellent idea. Greek language is enormously beautiful and complex, and sometimes the totally different senses of the valid translations which have been produced are astonishing. You'll remember when I took an ancient philosophy class as an undergraduate with a fairly prominent analytic philosophy professor. I was very absorbed in reading Heidegger's writings on Aristotle and his unusual translations of some passages in Aristotle, and I asked the professor what her opinion was of the definitiveness of the Oxford edition of Aristotle's collected writings. I was astonished to hear that according to her, we are reading in the Oxford Aristotle exactly the same Aristotle who spoke in Athens, a text which is essentially one in meaning as the surviving ancient Greek. What about the centuries of studying Aristotle in Latin translation and the Latinization of Aristotle, I asked, which is still clearly influencing the available scholarly translations? Oh, that doesn't matter at all, was the reply. 2,000 years of scholarly disagreement has led to an irrefutable consensus, which that we can be assured that when we read Aristotle in the Oxford edition, the real meaning of the original passages in Greek should jump out before our eyes. I found this opinion to be truly absurd, if not perverse. It is extremely clear to anyone who reads Aristotle in Greek, the sense of particular words and their coherence in an overall argument is a subject of immense controversy, and we do ourselves a great disservice by limiting ourselves to the standard Oxford Aristotle. In fact, much of Aristotle's work has been lost. We'll be looking at some writings on some of the lost works later in the course. Raises the question of reliability and accessibility in trying to reconstruct the world of ancient Greek philosophy from the only 10% or so of their sources that we have. Only in the case of Plotinus are we reasonably confident we have all his written works. In some cases, forming a judgment is impossible. For example, we have less than 3% of Epicurus and almost no Chrysippus. In many cases, the copies or fragments that we have inherited are very unreliable and framed within competing outlooks and worldviews. Despite all this, we've inherited a lot. The foundations of mathematics, natural science, social science, literary criticism, rhetoric, historiography, theology, all fields that counted as philosophy during this entire millennia. Hado, stamatellos, and our textbook agree that while ancient Greek religion is pretty fascinating and I think awesome, it did lack a certain amount of coherence and authority, characteristic of other major religions. Greek religion placed emphasis on festivals and rituals rather than on a systematic theology or a canonical set of required beliefs. Furthermore, the stories, or mythoi, were flexible generationally, and so it's true that myths provided only murky accounts of the origins of the world and of humankind. Greeks really began to ask fundamental questions such as how did everything begin? How did humans come into being? What is the meaning or purpose of anything? They came to modify, adapt, and transform their worldview, inventing science in the process. The idea that Greek philosophy, and often only Greek philosophy, is the origin of what will eventually be known as natural science is, however, a myth of its own. But in order to understand and later critique this myth on its own terms, let's familiarize ourselves with its basic story. So the earliest Greek philosophers were called physiologoi by Aristotle, that is, those who gave a logos of physis, or nature. Physiologoi began from wonder and attempted to explain all beings in the world, or cosmos. This sets up the beginning of an opposition between philosophy and religion, because religion tends to preserve mystery over coherent rational explanations. The Greek philosophers approached the cosmos as a harmoniously unified and ordered system that could be explained, and many focused on providing comprehensive new cosmologies, or cosmogonies, that is, unified accounts of the cosmos, that sought after explanatory or causal origins, arche. Many of the earliest Greek philosophers were hylozoists. For them, matter was alive and nature an organic system, and this accorded loosely with Greek folk understandings of nature as growing, physis, or phuine. Set the boundaries of the living and the non-living was a subject of dispute, but most of the Pre-Socratics accord life to the universe as a whole. Many questioned and theorized in terms of a distinction between appearance and reality, and gradually knowledge itself, its functioning, and its limitation was theorized. Physics was invented and refined in Aristotle's lectures on physics as concerning change and other basic concepts that pattern all experience, such as space, time, motion, and potentiality. After Aristotle, the model of philosophical rationality, or science, was that of the four causes, probably better known as the four modes of explaining something. According to Aristotle, his predecessors had been confused about what counts as an explanatory ground. Prior to Aristotle, thinkers tended to offer explanations of the cosmos in terms of some, but not all, explanatory principles. Pre-Socratics tending to focus on the material cause alone, and Plato, Aristotle's teacher, focusing on the formal cause. So in Aristotle, you see a distinct transition between the Pre-Socratics and Plato in terms of the first two causes, matter, or the material cause, and form, or the formal cause. Pre-Socratic materialism explains everything that exists in terms of one primal substance, from Thales' water to Empedocles' four elements, whereas Pythagoras and Plato tend to explain the world in terms of forms, such as numbers or ideas. The only of the four causes that accords with our modern scientific understanding of causality is the third one, the efficient cause, what does the causing. And Aristotle focused on this as essential as well as the function, or final cause. For Aristotle, everything in the world fulfilling a purpose or a function, and nature being in many ways a grand teleological system. A view that has definitely fallen out of fashion since Darwin. Greek philosophers also theorized human nature and its uniqueness extensively, asking how are we different from natural beings and how are we the same? The answer that was focused on is that we are social animals and live in the qualified life, or bios, of a society, and thus live in accordance with culture in ways that the animal world does not, or does only in rudimentary forms. According to Aristotle, we are also beings of reason, or language, logos, animals that have the logos. Sometimes language and reasoning, logos and legein, were not extensively distinguished. What is the basic function of our lives, according to the Greek philosophers? Well, many religions say it's to fulfill the will of God, but the Greeks focused less on enforceable rules and more on human characteristics and flourishing, how to live a good life, what is noble, and by the classical period, how to attain fulfillment, happiness, or eudaimonia. Furthermore, Greek psychology was not as rationalistic and superficial as some readings of Plato might suggest. Most all Greek philosophers were not intellectualists when it comes to the good life, but included the appetites and the passions as part of our overall psychic harmony. Greek ethics was less a morality or moralistic than it was about ethos and bios, that is, the way of life of the specific form of life or qualified life that human beings experience, as opposed to the zoe or mere life of things in nature. Hegel, in seeking to transcend and explain Kant's morality of principles, returns to the Greek idea of ethos in his notion of Sittlichkeit. A form of ethics that the Greeks specifically invented we know now as virtue ethics, the cultivation of virtue and nobility being essential for the good life. Politically, the Greek states varied greatly in the form of government across generations, but the Greeks are most famous for having invented democracy, as we'll see, a form of political isonomia, or relation of equals. Our textbook concludes some humorous and ironic aspects. Since English is about 20% rooted in Greek words, when we study Greek philosophy, it's astonishing to see how different the meaning of many key terms are between then and now. Platonic love in Plato's Symposium does transcend sexuality, but it's still very sexual. The Cynics were not necessarily cynical. The Epicureans were the opposites of pleasure seekers. The Stoics were more about profound understandings of nature and life, rather than passionless endurance of suffering. And the Skeptics were rarely skeptical in the modern sense, but sometimes profoundly pious within their skepticism. In Stamatelis' introduction, he gives us a list of all the main names and the dates of their flourishing. Don't be overwhelmed, but you will remember most of these names long after you finish the class and know what ideas they were associated with. Our course will begin in the Ionians and then move to the Eleatics and the classical periods, roughly weeks 1 to 11. The last few weeks of the course will turn to the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Skeptics, the Cynics, and the Neoplatonists. The final end of ancient philosophy is generally dated to the capture of Alexandria by Muslims in 641 CE. Stamatelis helpfully gives us 8 cultural contexts or reasons for the Pre-Socratic revolution, aka the birth of philosophy around the 6th century BCE in Miletus and areas thereabouts. Although we're used to thinking of classical Athens as the cultural high point in the history of the Greeks, really the Ionian city-states were extremely sophisticated in the 6th century BC, well before the rise of the Athenian Empire. They had extensive contact and trade with the Babylonians, the Hebrews, the Phoenicians, and the Egyptians, and Greek colonies were often more open to new ideas than major city-states in the mainland. Religiously, Greek cult was often open-ended and multidivergent, and polytheism tended to embrace the principle of intercultural translatability. Greek alphabet, after the Greek Dark Ages, was actually adopted from the Phoenicians. Earlier civilizations like the Minoans and the Mycenaeans had their own writing system, and it enabled precision and pan-Hellenic knowledge to be spread since the 7th and 6th century BCE, so that's a major cause for the emergence of philosophy. Politically, movements from the 6th century BC onwards tended to foster plurality of practices and customs and promoted critical reflection and argument. Since the writing down and canonization of the basic texts of Homer and Hesiod around the 7th and 8th century BCE, literary education became based in these earlier texts. Epic poetry focused on human heroism and divine activity, lyric poetry on conflicting emotions and the self, and so is in a way the origin of psychology. Greek education encouraged dialogue and debate when interpreting these literary sources. Another major aspect of the Greek cultural spirit that spurred the development of philosophy is the emphasis on competition, or the Greek agon. The Greeks loved their sports and athletic competitions rooted in gymnastike, as well as poetical and musical compositions, and it seems definite that a spirit of intellectual competition spurred self-transforming development of Greek philosophy. The Greeks also were in critical dialogue with each other, and their relationship to tradition was fairly unique. Rather than venerating the old wise master and sticking closely to his teachings, Greek philosophers regularly committed intellectual parricide, criticizing and refuting their mentors rather than venerating them. Anaximander refuted Thales, Anaximenes refuted Anaximander. Parmenides is said to have refuted Heraclitus, although we'll see this isn't quite true. Empedocles is said to have transcended Zeno, and Socrates to have gone beyond Anaxagoras. and so on and so forth. Finally, the development of a form of expression in prose rather than traditional poetry spurred the development of Greek philosophy, and interestingly, a mythical thinker, Pherecydes of Samos, is thought to be the first to write a treatise on nature. So the term Pre-Socratic was introduced by German scholars only in the 19th to 20th century, the Vor-Socratiker. Early studies tended to oppose an earlier naturalistic tradition to the anthropocentric spirit of Socrates' ethical teachings, but this is generally now considered to be superficial. The Pre-Socratics were concerned with ethics, religion, and politics, not just cosmology and metaphysics, and the dividing line in terms of theme and content between Socrates and the Pre-Socratics isn't nearly so clear as it was once thought to be, or is sometimes taken to be, in superficial overview classes. Two basic strands of contemporary Pre-Socratic studies. On the one hand, those following the historico-critical approach, which was influenced by Hegelianism and then continental philosophy. On the other, those following the analytic approach, which was influenced by linguistic analysis and formal logic. Recent scholarship has tended to fuse both these approaches. Modern Pre-Socratic studies, it should be noted, began around the Renaissance, but it wasn't until the 18th to 19th century that editions became widely available. The first English textbook on the Pre-Socratics didn't actually appear until 1892, and the first complete edition of the Pre-Socratics didn't appear until 1903. First edition of Diels's monumental book only included the Seven Sages under the Pre-Socratics, and later edition included more religious thinkers such as Pherecydes and even the surviving fragments of Orpheus. Although the radical transformation of Pre-Socratic into post-Socratic philosophy is summed up in changing attitudes towards the Greek word phusis, beginning, the development, and the result of a process by which a thing constitutes itself. Plato begins a process whereby phusis, or nature, is objectified and demoted with respect to the ideas or forms. This is why although Plato never used the word metaphysics, he's often considered to be the first metaphysician. For Plato, the universe is no longer born of the automism of phusis, but is a product of the rationality of the soul, and the soul, as the first principle, is prior to everything else and is thus identified with phusis. Between the 6th century BC and the 4th, the mode of education of the youth had also changed significantly in Greek culture. Education had always been the privilege and preoccupation of the class of nobles or those who possessed arete. It was aristocratic and involved primarily ethical precepts. To this was added in the classical period a focus on training young people to become leaders who acquired mastery of language, and this is the need to which the sophistic movement would respond. The sophists were like itinerant professors who charged a fee to teach rhetoric, philosophy, and politics. Sometimes they were conservative and sometimes more radical with respect to tradition. It's in the surviving writings of the sophists that we see the first development of the idea of a fundamental break or conflict between nature on the one hand and human conventions and laws or phusis on the other. The sophists were the first philosophers or instructors to invent education in an artificial environment, like us online right now, a system that was to remain a characteristic of Western civilization, especially in 2020. It is in the writings of Herodotus, the Greek historian, that we first find the idea of doing philosophy, to wit, as associated with the Athenian city-state and its king, Solon. In this account, Athens is identified by another king, Croesus, as a city germane for those who have a taste for wisdom, philosophion. From there, the word became popular to describe the type of intellectual activity that was proper to the Athenians and constituted a sort of civic pride. A slightly later historian, Thucydides, writes, "We cultivate beauty with simplicity, and we do philosophy without lacking in firmness." Remember that philosophical activity at this time included everything related to intellectual and general culture, the speculations of the Pre-Socratics, the birth of the sciences, theories of language, rhetorical techniques, and the arts of political persuasion. Plato notes that the words philosophos and philosophine presuppose the notion of Sophia. It is odd, therefore, that during the classical period there is not an extensive discussion of the meaning of the term Sophia. It seems rather to be more or less taken for granted that the wise person, or sophos, knows and has seen many things, has traveled a great deal, is broadly cultured, hopefully additionally knows how to conduct themselves in life and live in happiness. Even carpenters who lived well were called sophos, and so were technical inventors. connection in the term sophos to creative artisanship and poetic inspiration, or the inspiration of the muses, continued in Solon's time. This probably dates to the old rivalry of kings and poets. Hesiod quips self-servingly, of course, that poets are as wise as kings. Clearly, mastery of language in poetry is especially associated with Sophia. Sophia is also associated with pragmatic skill in social interactions and military ventures. From the 6th century on, the flourishing of the exact sciences such as medicine, mathematics, geometry, and astronomy added to the notion of Sophia. There were no longer experts only in the arts and politics, but now there existed experts in every domain of science. From the Pre-Socratics on, the one who knows nature, physis, is sophos. For the sophists, the word Sophia meant first and foremost know-how in political life. In short, the notion of Sophia as philosophical wisdom had yet to be fully developed. And lastly, to finish up this introductory week, I wanted to speak a little about the role of women in ancient Greek philosophy. Unfortunately, it must be admitted that their roles in early and classical and later periods of philosophy was severely curtailed. However, there are notable and interesting exceptions. For example, Pythagoras' wife, Theano, and his daughter, Arignote, are notable philosophers in their own right. And during Hellenistic times, Hypatia of Alexandria was the head of the Neoplatonic Academy in Alexandria. Since the rise of feminist scholarship after the 1950s, philosophy has become a gradually more gender and race-diverse discipline, although there's still a long way to go. And since this is a history of ancient philosophy class, almost all of the major figures we'll be studying were men. Whether they were also white-skinned men is a complicated question in the case of the ancient world, as we'll gradually see. But for more on women in ancient Greek philosophy and for potential projects related to your presentations or essays, I recommend Emmy Waite's 4-volume History of Women Philosophers. The first volume is the one relevant for us. So I hope you enjoyed your first video. Welcome to week 1 of History of Ancient Philosophy, and I look forward to meeting you all in the discussions more this week.